Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The transfer principle. Paradox when powerlessness spreads like a virus. A philosopher constructs a principle about power and control, about what things are and are not within our ability to affect. And the principle seems obviously true, seems like basic logic about how powerlessness transfers. And the principle says that if you have no power over one fact and that fact entails another fact and you have no power over the entailment itself, then you have no power over the second fact either. Powerlessness transfers across entailment, spreads from premises to conclusions, and this transfer principle is the backbone of the consequence argument for incompatibilism, is what allows the argument to move from our powerlessness over the past and laws to our powerlessness over the present. And yet, compatibilists deny this principle, argue that it is false, that powerlessness does not always transfer, that you can have power over a fact even when that fact is entailed by facts you have no power over. And this creates a paradox, because the transfer principle seems undeniable, seems like it must be true, and yet if it is true, then compatibilism is false. And if it is false, then the consequence argument fails, and both options are difficult. Both require accepting something counterintuitive, and this is the transfer principle paradox. The puzzle about whether powerlessness transfers, whether the principle is a logical truth or contains hidden errors, and the paradox sits at the heart of the free will debate, determines whether incompatibilism or compatibilism wins. And no consensus has emerged. Philosophers remain divided, and the transfer principle stands as one of the most contested principles in metaphysics. A principle that seems obvious, but whose truth determines fundamental questions about freedom and determinism. Imagine the transfer principle applied to a simple case. You have no power over the fact that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang plus the laws of physics entail the current state of the universe, including your current action, and you have no power over the laws of physics, and you have no power over the entailment itself, over the fact that the Big Bang and laws entail your action. And so by the transfer principle, you have no power over your current action. Your action is not up to you, is not within your control, and if you have no power over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this reasoning seems airtight, seems like it must be correct, and yet compatibilists deny the conclusion, deny that determinism eliminates power, and so they must deny the transfer principle, must argue that power does not transfer in the way the principle claims. The transfer principle can be stated formally using symbols. If no one has power over P, and P entails Q, and no one has power over the entailment from P to Q, then no one has power over Q. And this seems like a valid rule of inference about power, seems like it should be uncontroversial, and yet compatibilists argue it contains a subtle error, a conflation of different senses of power, or an invalid inference structure, or an equivocation on what it means to have power over something. And these objections attempt to show that the transfer principle, despite its intuitive appeal, is actually false, and powerlessness does not always transfer. Visualize powerlessness as a property that might or might not spread from one fact to another, like a contagion that sometimes transmits and sometimes does not. And the transfer principle says the contagion always spreads across entailment, always passes from premises to conclusions. But compatibilists say transmission is blocked under certain conditions, say that the link between premises and conclusions does not preserve powerlessness in the way incompatibilists claim. And this disagreement is fundamental, shapes the entire free will debate, determines which arguments succeed and which fail. One compatibilist response to the transfer principle distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power to make something the case and the power to have made something the case, and argues that the transfer principle conflates these, that while you lack the power to have made the past different, you do have the power to make the present what it is, and the presence being entailed by the past does not eliminate your power over the present, does not make your action not up to you, and the transfer principle fails because it moves illegitimately from past-directed power to present-directed power, treats them as the same when they are different, and once the distinction is recognized, the principle's apparent validity disappears. Another compatibilist response argues that the transfer principle uses the wrong notion of power, defines power in terms of ability to falsify facts, ability to make false things that are true, and this notion of power is inappropriate, is not what matters for freedom, and the right notion of power is counterfactual power. Power such that, if you had chosen differently, then different things would have happened. And counterfactual power is not governed by the transfer principle, does not transfer from premises to conclusions in the way the principle claims. And so the principle fails as a constraint on freedom, fails to show that determinism eliminates the kind of power needed for responsibility. A third compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle for some inferences but denies it for others, argues that the principle is valid in some contexts but invalid in others, and the contexts where it fails are precisely the contexts involving agency and choice, contexts where the agent is part of the causal chain between past and present, and in these contexts the agent's involvement blocks transfer, prevents powerlessness from spreading from past to present, and the transfer principle is not a universal logical truth, but a context-sensitive inference rule that admits exceptions. Incompatibilists defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist objections are sophistical, involve verbal tricks and redefinitions that obscure the real issue, and the transfer principle is valid, is a genuine constraint on power. And if you have no power over the past and laws, then you have no power over anything entailed by them. And this includes your present actions. And so determinism eliminates power, eliminates control, and compatibilism is false. And the transfer principle stands as a cornerstone of incompatibilist arguments, a principle that compatibilists cannot successfully reject without abandoning common sense about how powerlessness works. The debate over the transfer principle has generated enormous technical literature, philosophers constructing formal versions of the principle in modal logic, testing it against various cases, proposing refinements and modifications, and no consensus has emerged, and the debate reveals deep disagreements about the nature of power, about what it means to have something be up to you, about whether power is a metaphysical notion or an epistemic notion. And these disagreements shape views about free will, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. The transfer principle also connects to debates about counterfactuals, about what would have happened if things had been different, because compatibilists often appeal to counterfactuals to explain power, say that you have power over your action because if you'd chosen differently, you would have acted differently. And incompatibilists respond that these counterfactuals do not show genuine power. Because the antecedent is impossible given determinism, you could not have chosen differently given the past and laws, and so the counterfactuals are vacuous, and compatibilist power is illusory, and the transfer principle makes this explicit, shows that compatibilist power is not real power because it is entailed by facts you have no power over. The principle stands at the centre of the free will debate, determines whether the consequence argument succeeds, whether incompatibilism is established, whether determinism is compatible with freedom, and both sides have powerful arguments. Both can make their case seem compelling, and the stalemate persists, and perhaps this reflects something deep. Perhaps the transfer principle is one of those principles where our intuitions are divided, where different ways of thinking about power lead to different judgments, and no argument can establish the principle or refute it definitively, and we are left with competing perspectives, incompatibilist and compatibilist, each coherent internally, each unsatisfying to those who adopt the other, and the transfer principle paradox endures, a principle that seems both obviously true and demonstrably false, depending on how you think about power and control. And the paradox remains unresolved, remains central to debates about free will, and powerlessness spreads or does not spread, transfers or is blocked, and which answer is correct determines whether we are free, and the transfer principle stands, controversial and crucial, a principle whose truth or falsity shapes fundamental metaphysical questions about agency and determinism. The voting paradox, when adding voters changes winners, impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C, and this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox, the demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties. And the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems. And the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest. And C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first. And in the first round, A receives 4 first-place votes. B receives 2. C receives 1. So C is eliminated again. And C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated. But A has most first-place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest. And B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original 2 B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first, and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders. And the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures, by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems, and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff find few, if any, cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems, where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. And approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes, and this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. and a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve, and some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves. Zuboff's paradox, a thought experiment in personal identity, asks us to imagine a machine that can instantly create a perfect duplicate of a person, atom by atom, molecule by molecule, and the duplicate is placed in a different location, perhaps on Mars while the original remains on Earth, and both individuals emerge from the process with all the same memories, the same personality, the same sense of being the person who entered the machine. And now the question arises, which one is the real person? Which one continues the original stream of consciousness? And Zuboff's paradox, presented by Arnold Zuboff, pushes this scenario further by asking what happens if the duplication process creates not just one copy, but many copies, perhaps millions, all scattered across the universe, all emerging simultaneously with the same memories and the same conviction that they are the original person. And the paradox is that if one copy preserves personal identity, then it seems that all copies should preserve it. But if all copies are the original person, then identity has become plural. One person has become many. And this seems to violate the transitivity and uniqueness of identity. The principle that identity is a one-to-one relation, that if A is identical to B and A is identical to C, then B must be identical to C. But if millions of copies all claim to be the original person and none has a privileged status, then they cannot all be numerically identical to each other. They are distinct individuals occupying different locations. And so, identity seems to have been destroyed or multiplied in ways that make no sense. The paradox challenges the intuition that psychological continuity is sufficient for personal identity. The view associated with John Locke and Derek Parfit that what makes a future person the same person as a present person is the continuity of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and other psychological characteristics. And this view seems plausible when considering ordinary cases of survival through time. The person who wakes up tomorrow is the same person who went to sleep tonight, because there is psychological continuity, but the duplication case shows that psychological continuity cannot be sufficient for identity because identity is one-to-one, while psychological continuity can be one-to-many. Multiple future individuals can all be psychologically continuous with a single past individual, and if we say that only one of them is the original person, then we need a criterion to distinguish that one from the others. And no such criterion seems available if all the copies are physically and psychologically identical. Zuboff's contribution is to emphasize the symmetry of the situation. When there are multiple copies and no physical or psychological differences between them, there is no non-arbitrary way to select one as the original, and the others as mere copies, and if we are forced to say that none of them is the original, that personal identity was destroyed by the duplication process, then we must accept that identity is incompatible with duplication, that what matters for survival is not just psychological continuity, but also the absence of competitors, the requirement that there be, at most, one future individual who is psychologically continuous with the present individual. And this requirement seems strange, seems to make identity depend on what happens to other people, on whether duplicates exist rather than on intrinsic facts about the individual's own physical and psychological continuity. The paradox connects to debates about what matters in survival. Parfit argued that identity is not what matters. that what we care about when we care about survival is not numerical identity, but psychological connectedness and continuity. And if these can be preserved and even multiplied, then we should regard that as a good thing, as a kind of proliferation of what matters, rather than a loss of identity. And Parfit bit the bullet, accepting that in duplication cases, the original person does not survive as a single individual, but survives in a broader sense as multiple individuals, each with equal claim to being a continuation of the original. And this view dissolves the paradox by rejecting the assumption that survival requires identity, but it strikes many people as counterintuitive, as a refusal to take seriously the distinctness of persons. The fact that I am one person, not many, and that survival means that I, this particular individual, continue to exist. Not that some psychologically similar individuals exist. Others have proposed that identity in duplication cases is vague or indeterminate, that there is no fact of the matter about which copy, if any, is the original, that identity admits of degrees or borderline cases. And this indeterminacy is not a sign of ignorance, but a feature of the metaphysics, a reflection of the fact that identity is a coarse-grained concept that breaks down in cases involving fission or duplication. And while this response accommodates the intuition that duplication creates a puzzle, it does so by accepting that some questions about identity have no determinate answers, and this itself is a controversial metaphysical commitment. Still others distinguish between survival and identity, arguing that survival is a looser relation than identity, that survival can occur without identity if there is sufficient continuity and connectedness, and that in duplication cases, all the copies survive, even though none is identical to the original. And this view preserves the one-to-one nature of identity, while allowing that what we care about, survival, can be a one-to-many relation, and it provides a framework for thinking about duplication that does not force us to choose between denying continuity matters or accepting the multiplication of identity. Zuboff's paradox also has implications for practical ethics, for questions about the permissibility of creating duplicates, about whether duplicating a person harms them or benefits them or does neither, about whether the duplicates have the same rights and responsibilities as the original, and about how to distribute resources or assign credit and blame when multiple individuals all have equal claim to being the continuation of a single person. And these questions have no obvious answers. They require rethinking fundamental assumptions about personhood, autonomy, and moral status. The duplication machine hums. The original person steps inside, and moments later, millions of copies emerge across the universe, each one waking with the conviction that they are the person who entered the machine, each one feeling the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of memory, the seamless transition from before to after. And yet, something has changed. Identity has fractured or multiplied or disappeared, and the paradox asks what has happened, what it means to survive when survival takes this form, and the answers do not come easily. They require choosing between intuitions that cannot all be preserved, between the importance of identity and the importance of continuity, between the uniqueness of persons and the possibility of multiplication. And Zuboff's paradox remains a powerful challenge to theories of personal identity, a thought experiment that exposes tensions and forces choices, and it endures as a puzzle that has no consensus solution, no answer that satisfies all intuitions, only a set of options, each with costs, each requiring the abandonment of something we thought was certain, and the copies live their lives, scattered across space, each believing themselves to be the original, and perhaps they are, or perhaps none of them are, or perhaps the question has no answer, and the paradox persists, unresolved, a permanent feature of the landscape of personal identity, a reminder that who we are, what it means to survive, what it means to be the same person over time, are questions that remain open, that resist final answers, and that become stranger and more perplexing the more carefully we examine them. Frankfurt's counterexamples. When you're responsible. Even though you had no choice, a person decides to perform an action, decides on their own, without coercion, based on their own reasons and desires, and they perform the action, and we say they are morally responsible. They acted freely. They deserve praise or blame for what they did. And traditional theories of moral responsibility say that responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person could have chosen differently, that they had genuine alternatives, and this principle, called the principle of alternate possibilities, seems obvious, seems essential to responsibility, because how can you be responsible for an action if you had no choice, if you were forced to do it, if no alternative was possible? And yet philosopher Harry Frankfurt constructed examples that challenge this principle. Examples where a person acts on their own, makes their own decision, but could not have done otherwise, and yet intuitively seems responsible. And these are Frankfurt's counterexamples. Thought experiments designed to show that the principle of alternate possibilities is false. That responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that what matters is how you acted, whether the action flowed from your own will, not whether you could have acted differently. And Frankfurt's cases have been enormously influential, have reshaped debates about free will and responsibility, have challenged incompatibilist arguments that say determinism undermines responsibility, and the counterexamples remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently changed the landscape of discussions about freedom. Imagine the example: a person named Jones decides to perform an action, decides to vote for a certain candidate, and Jones makes this decision on his own, based on his own political views, his own deliberation. No one forces him, no one coerces him, and he goes to vote, and he is about to vote for the candidate he chose. And at this moment, unbeknownst to Jones, there is another person, call him Black, who has been monitoring Jones's brain states, and Black has the ability to intervene, to manipulate Jones's brain, to force Jones to vote for the candidate if Jones shows signs of changing his mind, and Black is prepared to intervene but does not need to, because Jones votes for the candidate on his own, makes the decision himself, and Black's intervention mechanism remains dormant, unused. And the question Frankfurt asks is whether Jones is morally responsible for his vote, and intuitively the answer is yes. Jones voted based on his own decision, his own reasons. Black's presence made no difference. Black did nothing, and Jones is responsible just as he would be if Black did not exist. And yet Jones could not have done otherwise, because if he had tried to vote differently, Black would have intervened, would have forced him to vote for the candidate. And so Jones had no alternative, could not have avoided voting as he did, and yet he is responsible. And this shows that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that the principle of alternate possibilities is false. The structure of Frankfurt cases involves two elements. The person acts on their own, based on their own will, their own reasons, and there is a counterfactual intervener, someone or something that would have prevented any alternative action, that ensures the person does what they do. But the intervener does not actually act, remains dormant, and so the person's action is their own, even though alternatives were blocked. And Frankfurt argues that what matters for responsibility is not whether alternatives existed, but whether the person acted on their own, whether their action flowed from their own will. And in Frankfurt cases, the action does flow from the person's own will, and so they are responsible even though they could not have done otherwise. Visualize moral responsibility as depending on the actual sequence, on how the action was actually produced, rather than on alternative sequences on what might have happened. And in Frankfurt cases, the actual sequence is normal. The person deliberates and chooses and acts, while alternative sequences are blocked by the intervener. And since responsibility depends on the actual sequence, the person is responsible, and the blocked alternatives are irrelevant. And this shows that incompatibilists are wrong to think that determinism, by ruling out alternatives, undermines responsibility, because even if determinism rules out alternatives, as long as people act on their own, based on their own reasons, they are responsible, and responsibility is compatible with determinism. Critics of Frankfurt cases have offered various objections. One objection denies that the person really lacked alternatives, argues that in Frankfurt cases there are flicker alternatives, tiny alternatives, that remain open until the very last moment, moments where the person could begin to choose differently before the intervener stops them, and these flickers are enough to preserve the principle of alternate possibilities, enough to ground responsibility, and so Frankfurt cases do not refute the principle, only show that responsibility does not require robust alternatives, only requires minimal alternatives, tiny flickers of freedom. Another objection questions whether Frankfurt cases really elicit the intuition that the person is responsible, argues that when we imagine the cases carefully, when we recognize that the person truly could not have done otherwise, our intuition of responsibility weakens. And maybe Jones is not fully responsible. Maybe the presence of Black's intervention mechanism, even though unused, affects responsibility, creates a situation where praise and blame are inappropriate, and this response denies that Frankfurt cases generate clear counterexamples, argues that intuitions are unclear or support the principle of alternate possibilities rather than undermining it. A third objection distinguishes between moral responsibility and blameworthiness, argues that Frankfurt cases might show that people can be causally responsible, can be the source of an action, even without alternatives. But this does not show they are morally responsible, does not show they deserve blame or praise, and moral responsibility requires more than being the source of action, requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person had control, and Frankfurt cases do not establish moral responsibility, only causal responsibility. Frankfurt has refined his examples over decades, responding to objections, constructing new variants, and the debate continues, with defenders arguing that Frankfurt cases successfully refute the principle of alternate possibilities, show that compatibilism is correct, that responsibility does not require alternatives, and critics arguing that the cases are flawed, that intuitions are unclear, that responsibility does require alternatives after all, and no consensus has emerged. But Frankfurt's contribution is undeniable, has forced philosophers to clarify what responsibility requires, to distinguish between different kinds of freedom, different kinds of control, and to recognize that the relationship between determinism and responsibility is more complex than simple, incompatibilist arguments suggest. Frankfurt's counterexamples also connect to debates about moral luck, about whether responsibility depends on factors beyond our control. Because in Frankfurt cases, the person is responsible, even though whether alternatives were available was beyond their control, was determined by Black's presence. And this suggests that responsibility is not undermined by factors beyond our control, is not sensitive to luck, and what matters is the actual sequence, how the person actually acted, not whether they were lucky enough to have alternatives. Jones stands in the voting booth, marks his ballot, and Black watches, does nothing, and Jones is responsible, is praised or blamed for his vote, and yet he could not have voted otherwise. And Frankfurt's case challenges traditional assumptions, challenges the principle of alternate possibilities, and forces recognition that responsibility is about actual causation, about whether the person's will was effective, not about whether alternatives existed. And Frankfurt's counterexamples endure as some of the most important thought experiments in philosophy of action, examples that reshaped debates about free will, that challenged incompatibilist arguments, that supported compatibilism, and that remained controversial, remained debated, but have permanently influenced how philosophers think about moral responsibility, about what it requires, about whether determinism threatens it, and the counterexamples persist as permanent features of the landscape, cases that every theory of responsibility must address, must accommodate, or explain away. And Frankfurt's legacy includes these cases, these examples that showed that responsibility might not require what we thought it required, might not depend on alternatives, but on something else, on source, on causation, on whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And the debate continues, and Jones votes, and Black does nothing, and the question remains whether Jones is responsible, and Frankfurt says yes, and the counterexamples stand, challenging, probing, revealing complexity in concepts we thought were simple. Hilbert's Hotel Paradox, a hotel with infinitely many rooms, each numbered with a positive integer, 1, 2, 3, and so on without end, stands fully occupied. Every room contains a guest, and yet when a new guest arrives, the manager is not concerned, does not turn them away, because infinity accommodates addition in ways that finite quantities cannot. And the manager simply asks each current guest to move to the next room. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on, each guest shifting one room higher. And this process, applied simultaneously to all guests, leaves room 1 vacant, and the new arrival is accommodated without displacing anyone permanently. And this is Hilbert's Hotel, a thought experiment devised by the mathematician David Hilbert to illustrate the counterintuitive properties of infinite sets, to show that infinite collections behave in ways that violate ordinary intuition, that they can be put in one-to-one correspondence with proper subsets of themselves, that adding elements or removing elements does not change their cardinality, and that the whole is not always greater than the part when dealing with infinity. The paradox deepens when an infinite number of new guests arrive, an infinite bus pulling up to the hotel, each passenger needing a room. And again, the manager is unperturbed, because there is a strategy to accommodate everyone. The manager asks each current guest in room N to move to room 2N. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 4. The guest in room 3 moves to room 6, and so on. And this process places all the original guests in the even-numbered rooms, leaving all the odd-numbered rooms vacant. And since there are infinitely many odd-numbered rooms, one for each positive integer, there is exactly enough space for the infinitely many new arrivals, who are assigned to rooms 1, 3, 5, and so on. And the hotel, despite being full, has accommodated an infinite number of additional guests without anyone being displaced. The paradox reveals that infinite sets have a property called countable infinity. They can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, and this correspondence allows for operations that seem impossible with finite sets. A fully occupied hotel with finitely many rooms cannot accommodate additional guests without evicting someone. But a fully occupied hotel with infinitely many rooms can accommodate not just one additional guest, but infinitely many. And this does not mean the hotel was not really full before. All rooms were occupied, but rather that fullness does not prevent expansion when infinity is involved, that the concepts of full and empty take on new meanings in the infinite context. Hilbert's Hotel also allows for even stranger scenarios. Suppose infinitely many infinite buses arrive, each bus containing infinitely many passengers, and the hotel must accommodate all of them. And again, there is a strategy. The manager can use a pairing function, a mathematical technique that assigns a unique room number to each combination of bus number and seat number, ensuring that every passenger gets a unique room. And the hotel, starting from full occupancy, can expand to accommodate not just countably many new guests, but countably many groups of countably many new guests. Because the union of countably many countable sets is still countable, and so the total number of guests, after all the buses are accommodated, is the same cardinality as the number of guests before. Both are countably infinite. Both can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. The paradox challenges intuitions about size, quantity, and comparison, because it shows that infinite sets can be proper subsets of themselves and yet have the same cardinality. The even numbers are a proper subset of all natural numbers, missing all the odd numbers, and yet there are just as many even numbers as natural numbers. Both sets are countably infinite, and this violates the Euclidean principle that the whole is greater than the part, a principle that holds for finite sets but fails for infinite sets. And this failure is not a contradiction, but a distinctive feature of infinity, a marker that distinguishes finite from infinite. Hilbert's Hotel also raises questions about the physical realizability of actual infinities, because while the mathematics of infinite sets is well defined and consistent, whether actual infinite collections exist in the physical world is contested. Some philosophers and physicists argue that only potential infinities exist, processes that can continue indefinitely but never reach completion, while actual infinities, completed infinite totalities, are merely mathematical. Abstractions and the hotel paradox, with its fully occupied infinite structure, represents an actual infinity, and if such infinities cannot exist in reality, then the paradox is merely a mathematical curiosity without physical significance. But others argue that the universe may be spatially infinite, that time may extend infinitely into the past or future, and that quantum field theory involves infinite dimensional spaces. And if actual infinities are physically real, then the strange properties illustrated by Hilbert's Hotel may have real-world counterparts. The hotel also appears in theological discussions about divine attributes, because an omnipotent being might be thought to perform tasks that involve manipulating infinite collections. And Hilbert's Hotel shows that such manipulations are logically coherent, that infinity does not lead to contradiction, that an infinite hotel can be fully occupied and yet accommodate more guests. And this addresses worries that infinity is inherently paradoxical or incoherent, demonstrating that infinite structures follow consistent rules, even when those rules differ from finite intuitions. The hotel stands infinitely tall, infinitely long, each room numbered, each room occupied, and the new guest arrives. And there is room, always room, because infinity plus one is infinity, because infinity plus infinity is infinity, because the operations of addition and union that exhaust finite resources leave infinite resources unchanged, and the paradox reveals the strangeness of infinity, the way it defies expectation, the way it makes possible what seems impossible, and Hilbert's Hotel remains one of the most vivid and accessible illustrations of this strangeness, a story that captures in simple terms the profound weirdness of the infinite. And mathematicians use it to teach, to explain cardinality, to distinguish countable from uncountable infinities, to motivate Cantor's diagonal argument and the hierarchy of infinities. And philosophers use it to probe intuitions about existence, about the difference between actual and potential infinity, about whether the physical world contains or could contain infinite structures. And the hotel endures, a fictional place that illuminates real mathematics, a thought experiment that has become a permanent fixture in discussions of infinity, a paradox that is not a contradiction, but a revelation, a demonstration that infinity is not merely a large finite number, not merely an extension of ordinary quantity, but something qualitatively different, something that requires new concepts, new intuitions, and new ways of thinking about size, about number, about what it means for something to be more or less equal or unequal, full or empty. And the guests check in, infinitely many guests, and there is always room for more. Locke's sock paradox. John Locke, the 17th century philosopher, offered a thought experiment about identity and change that has come to be known as Locke's sock paradox, though Locke himself discussed it in the context of broader questions about personal identity and the persistence of objects over time. And the paradox concerns a sock, or in some versions a shoe or a shirt, that is gradually repaired over years until every part of the original has been replaced. And the question arises whether it is still the same sock or whether it has become a different sock. And if it is different, then when did the transformation occur? And this puzzle is closely related to the ship of Theseus, but focuses on everyday objects and the intuitions we have about artifacts, possessions, and the things we use and care about in ordinary life. Imagine a sock that develops a hole, and the hole is darned with new thread, and later another hole appears and is also repaired, and over time the entire sock is patched and repatched, thread by thread, until none of the original material remains. And yet throughout this process the sock has been continuously in use, worn by the same person, stored in the same drawer, and at no point was there a moment when someone discarded one sock and acquired a completely new one. And so there is a strong intuition that it is still the same sock. That identity has been preserved through gradual change. That continuity of use and function matter more than continuity of material. But now consider a variation. Suppose that each time the sock is repaired, the removed material is carefully saved, and eventually someone uses all the original threads to reconstruct a sock, weaving them back together into the original pattern. And now there are two socks, one that has been continuously worn and repaired, containing none of the original material, and one that has been reconstructed from the original material, but which has not been continuously used. And which of these is the original sock? Or are both originals? Or is neither? And different intuitions pull in different directions. Some say the continuously worn sock is the original because it has never ceased to exist, because there is an unbroken chain of identity linking it to the sock that was first worn years ago, while others say the reconstructed sock is the original because it's made of the original material, because material composition is what individuates objects. And still others say that both have some claim to being the original, or that the question has no determinate answer because identity is vague or conventional. Locke used examples like this to explore the conditions of identity over time, arguing that different kinds of things have different criteria for persistence, that a mass of matter is the same mass if it has the same constituent parts, but an artifact like a sock is the same sock if it has the same functional organization, and a living organism is the same organism if it has continuity of life, and a person is the same person if they have continuity of consciousness and memory. And so identity is not a single uniform relation, but varies depending on what kind of thing is in question. The sock paradox raises questions about artifacts and their relationship to their materials, because unlike natural objects, artifacts are defined partly by their functions and purposes. A sock is not just any piece of fabric, but a piece of fabric designed and shaped to be worn on a foot. And so perhaps what makes a sock the same sock over time is not the persistence of the same material, but the persistence of the same functional structure, the same ability to serve the purpose for which it was made. And if this is right, then the continuously repaired sock remains the original, even after all its material has been replaced, while the reconstructed sock, though made of original material, is a replica rather than the original because it lacks the continuity of function and use. But this view faces difficulties too, because it seems to make identity depend on extrinsic factors, on how the sock is used and perceived, rather than on intrinsic properties. And it raises the question of whether an artifact that is stored away unused for years ceases to be the same artifact, or whether a sock that is repaired and then used for a completely different purpose, say as a hand puppet, remains the same sock or becomes something else. The paradox also connects to questions about personal attachment and sentimental value, because people often care about particular objects, not merely because of their function, but because of their history, because of the associations and memories attached to them. And so a sock that has been worn for decades may have sentimental value that a newly reconstructed sock, even if materially identical, would not have. And this suggests that identity, at least in the context of personal possessions, is partly constituted by historical and relational properties, by the role the object has played in someone's life. And this relational view of identity implies that the continuously worn sock is the original because it has the right kind of historical connection to the person who owns it, while the reconstructed sock is a mere duplicate, physically similar, but lacking the history that gives the original its significance. The sock paradox also raises issues about vagueness and borderline cases because, in practice, the transition from original to replica is not sharp. There is no precise moment when the repaired sock stops being the original and becomes something else. And so perhaps the question of whether it is the same sock admits of no determinate answer. In borderline cases, perhaps identity is vague and the law of excluded middle. The principle that for any proposition, either it or its negation is true, fails for identity statements involving gradual change. The paradox has legal and practical implications as well. In contexts where the identity of an object matters for property rights, warranties, insurance claims, or historical authentication, courts and experts must sometimes decide whether a heavily restored painting or a rebuilt car is the same object as the original or a different object. And these decisions depend on criteria that are often contested, on judgments about how much change an object can undergo while remaining itself. And these judgments reveal that identity is not always a purely factual matter, but involves normative and pragmatic considerations, decisions about what we care about and what purposes our identity judgments are meant to serve. Lockie's sock sits in the drawer, worn and repaired, a humble object that embodies deep philosophical questions, and it reminds us that persistence through time is not as straightforward as common sense suggests, that the boundaries of objects are not fixed by nature, but negotiated through concepts and practices. That identity is a nexus of material, functional, historical, and relational factors, and that the question of whether something is the same thing it was before is often a question without a single correct answer, a question that depends on context, on what aspects of similarity and continuity we privilege, and on whether we are asking about material identity, functional identity, or historical identity. And the sock, like the ship of Theseus, sails on through philosophical discussion, a paradox that will not be mended, a puzzle that remains even after all its threads have been replaced. More's open question, argument why good cannot be defined. A philosopher claims to have defined goodness, claims that good means pleasure, or good means what evolution favoured, or good means what most people approve of, and the definition is offered with confidence, with arguments and evidence supporting it, and yet G.E. Moore, in his 1903 book Principia Ethica, pointed out a fatal problem with all such definitions, a problem so simple and devastating that it has shaped ethics ever since. And the problem is this: take any proposed definition of good, any equation of goodness, with some natural property, and you can always ask a meaningful question. You can ask, but is that property itself good? And the fact that this question remains open, remains intelligible, and not obviously silly, shows that the definition has failed, shows that good has not been captured by the natural property. And this is More's open question argument, a challenge to naturalistic definitions of good that attempts to prove that goodness is indefinable, that it cannot be reduced to any natural fact or property, that it is a simple, unanalyzable concept that we grasp directly through moral intuition but cannot explain in other terms. Imagine someone says good means pleasant, pleasure is what good is, and now More asks the open question, but is pleasure good? And this question makes sense, is not absurd, is not like asking whether bachelors are unmarried men, where the question is trivially answered by the definition. and the fact that we can meaningfully ask whether pleasure is good shows that good does not mean the same thing as pleasant. Otherwise, the question would be equivalent to asking whether pleasant things are pleasant, which is a meaningless tautology. And since the question is not meaningless, since we can intelligently disagree about whether pleasure is good, the definition must be wrong, must have failed to capture what goodness really is. The same argument applies to any naturalistic definition. If someone says good means evolutionarily advantageous, we can ask, but is what evolution favoured good? And this is an open question. Many people would say no, that evolution produces traits that help survival and reproduction, but not necessarily traits that are morally good, that rape and infanticide might be evolutionarily advantageous in some contexts, but are not good, and so the definition fails. Or if someone says good means desired by most people, we can ask, but is what most people desire good? And again, this is open. We can imagine societies where most people desire things that are actually bad, where popular opinion is mistaken, and so the definition fails again. Moore concluded that good is indefinable, not because we do not know what it is, but because it is a simple, primitive concept, like yellow or existence, something that cannot be broken down into simpler parts or explained in other terms, but must be grasped directly. And we know good through moral intuition, through a kind of perception that is not sensory but intellectual. And different people's intuitions might disagree, but that does not mean goodness is subjective. It might mean that some people perceive moral reality more clearly than others, just as some people have better colour vision, and Moore's position is a form of non-naturalism, the view that moral properties are real but not natural, not part of the physical world studied by science, but a distinct realm of normative facts that exist objectively. The open question argument has generated enormous controversy. Critics argue that it proves too much, that the same reasoning would show that nothing can be defined, because for any definition, we can ask an open question. If water is H2O, we can ask, but is H2O water? And before we learned the chemistry, this question was open. People could meaningfully disagree, and yet we now accept that water is H2O as a correct identity. Not a definition of meaning, but an empirical discovery about what water turns out to be. And perhaps good is like this. Perhaps good is identical to some natural property, not as a matter of meaning, but as an empirical fact about what goodness turns out to be. And the open question shows only that we have not yet discovered which natural property good is, not that no such property exists. Others argue that the open question argument assumes too much about how meaning works, assumes that if two terms mean the same thing, then they must be obviously synonymous. But this is false. Morning star and evening star both refer to Venus, but it was not obvious. People could meaningfully ask whether the morning star is the evening star. And so Moore's test fails. The fact that a question is open does not prove that the terms do not refer to the same thing. And so the open question argument does not establish that good is indefinable, only that the definition is not obvious, not transparent. And this leaves room for naturalistic theories that identify goodness with some natural property as an empirical discovery rather than a conceptual analysis. Visualize Moore's argument as a test applied to proposed definitions. Each definition is presented. Good equals X, and Moore applies the test. He asks, is X good? And if the question is intelligible, if it makes sense to ask, if competent speakers can understand the question and disagree about the answer, then the definition fails. X does not capture what good means. And Moore applies this test to definition after definition. Hedonism says good equals pleasure. Moore asks, is pleasure good? The question makes sense. Test failed. Naturalism says good equals natural property. Why? Moore asks, is why good? The question makes sense. Test failed. And the test seems to show that no natural property can be identical to goodness. That good resists reduction, resists naturalization, stands apart from the world of facts, and refers to something normative, something that cannot be captured by descriptive language. The argument has implications for metaethics, for the question of what kind of thing goodness is. If Moore is right, then moral realism, the view that moral facts exist objectively, must be non-naturalist, must accept that moral properties are sui generis, distinct from natural properties, irreducible to physics or biology or psychology, and this raises questions about how we can know moral facts, how moral properties relate to natural properties, whether moral facts can cause anything or play any role in explaining behaviour. And non-naturalism faces challenges, struggles to explain how we perceive non-natural properties, how they fit into a scientific worldview, whether they're compatible with naturalism about everything else. The open question argument also influenced emotivism and expressivism, non-cognitivist views that deny moral statements are factual claims at all, argue instead that moral language expresses attitudes or emotions rather than describing reality, and these views claim to explain why the open question is always open, because good does not refer to any property, natural or non-natural, but expresses approval or prescribes action. And so asking whether X is good is asking whether to approve of X, whether to pursue it. And this is always an open question, always something we can meaningfully deliberate about. But the non-cognitivists deny Moore's conclusion, deny that goodness is a real property we intuit, argue instead that moral language has a different function, is not in the business of describing reality, but of expressing commitments and guiding action. Moore's argument changed the landscape of ethics, forced philosophers to take seriously the question of whether moral properties are natural or non-natural, whether moral knowledge is empirical or a priori, whether ethics can be reduced to science or remains a distinct domain, and the argument remains controversial. Some see it as a decisive refutation of naturalism. Others see it as a confusion about meaning and reference. And the debate continues, with naturalists proposing sophisticated identities between moral and natural properties, with non-naturalists defending irreducible normativity, and with non-cognitivists denying that moral language describes properties at all. And Moore's open question sits at the centre of these disputes, a simple test that reveals deep issues about meaning, about value, about the relationship between facts and norms, and about whether goodness is something we discover in the world or something we project onto it. And the question remains open, always open, because that is what good does. It resists definition, resists reduction, remains stubbornly normative, always inviting the question, but is that really good? And no answer closes the question, no definition settles it. And Moore's argument endures as a reminder that ethics is not reducible to any other domain, that the normative cannot be fully naturalized, and that goodness, whatever it is, stands apart, indefinable, and irreducible, a primitive concept that we use but cannot explain. Newcomb's paradox, a being with perfect or near-perfect predictive abilities, presents you with two boxes, one transparent and one opaque. And the rules of the game are simple, but the decision is agonizing. And this is Newcomb's paradox, a thought experiment devised by physicist William Newcomb and popularized by philosopher Robert Nozick that has divided decision theorists and philosophers into rival camps for decades. The transparent box contains $1,000, visible and certain, while the opaque box contains either $1 million or nothing, and the amount depends on a prediction made by the being before you arrived. If the being predicted you would take only the opaque box, then it placed $1 million inside. But if it predicted you would take both boxes, then it left the opaque box empty. The being has made this offer to many people before and has never been wrong. Its predictions are accurate with such consistency that it seems to know the future, or at least to understand human psychology so deeply that it can foresee choices with near certainty. Now you must decide, do you take only the opaque box, trusting the prediction and hoping for $1 million? Or do you take both boxes, reasoning that whatever is in the opaque box is already determined, and you might as well collect the extra $1,000 from the transparent box? The paradox arises because two different principles of rational decision-making give opposite answers, and both seem compelling. The expected utility calculation favors taking only the opaque box, because if the being is almost always right, then taking only the opaque box gives you a high probability of receiving $1 million, while taking both boxes gives you a high probability of receiving only $1,000. And so the one-box strategy maximizes expected value. But the dominance principle suggests taking both boxes, because at the moment you make your choice, the contents of the boxes are already fixed. The being has already made its prediction and either placed the $1 million or not. And since the past cannot be changed, your decision cannot affect what is in the opaque box. And therefore, taking both boxes gives you $1,000 more than taking only the opaque box. No matter what the opaque box contains, and dominance reasoning says you should always choose the option that does better in every possible state of the world. The paradox forces a choice between two deeply held intuitions about rationality: the idea that rational agents should maximize expected utility, and the idea that rational agents should not leave money on the table when doing so cannot possibly make things worse. Philosophers and decision theorists remain divided. Some are one-boxers who argue that the being's predictive accuracy makes the dominance reasoning irrelevant, that the correlation between your choice and the contents of the box is so strong that you should act as if your decision causally affects the prediction, even though temporally it does not. While others are two-boxers who insist that causal reasoning demands taking both boxes, that the prediction is already made and your choice now cannot retroactively change it, and that one-boxers are falling prey to magical thinking, confusing correlation with causation. The paradox also touches on issues of free will and determinism, because if the being can predict your choice with perfect accuracy, then in what sense is the choice free? And if the choice is not free, then what does it mean to deliberate about it? And if determinism is true, does that undermine the concept of rational decision-making altogether? Newcomb's paradox has inspired the development of new decision theories, including causal decision theory, which endorses two-boxing, and evidential decision theory, which endorses one-boxing, as well as more exotic approaches like timeless decision theory and functional decision theory, which attempt to handle cases where agents can predict or simulate each other. The paradox remains unresolved, a strange meeting point of probability, causation, choice, and prediction, a puzzle that reveals how little we understand about what it means to decide, and whether the principles we use to navigate an uncertain world are as solid as we believe, or whether they crumble when pressed against beings who can see through us, who know what we will do before we do it, who turn decision-making into a game where the rules themselves are in question. Richard's paradox. In 1905, the French mathematician Jules Richard discovered a paradox that strikes at the heart of how language and mathematics interact, revealing that certain kinds of definitions can generate contradictions no matter how carefully they're constructed. Consider the set of all real numbers that can be defined in a finite number of words using the English language. And this set seems reasonable at first because most numbers we ever think about can be described in some way. Pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. The square root of 2 is the length of the diagonal of a unit square, and so on. Since there are only finitely many words in the English language and only finitely many ways to arrange them into sentences of any given length, there can only be countably many such descriptions, which means there are only countably many real numbers that can be defined in this way. Yet the real numbers are uncountable, as Georg Cantor proved, which means there must exist real numbers that cannot be defined in any finite number of English words. numbers that are forever beyond the reach of language, numbers that exist but cannot be named or described or pointed to in any way. Now comes the paradox. Consider the real number defined as follows. Let it be the first real number in the set of all real numbers that cannot be defined in a finite number of English words, arranged in some standard ordering, such as numerical order. This definition appears to successfully define a specific real number, and the definition itself uses only a finite number of English words, which means the number it defines belongs to the set of numbers that can be defined in a finite number of words, but the definition explicitly states that the number belongs to the set of numbers that cannot be defined in a finite number of words, and so the contradiction emerges, sharp and unavoidable. If the number can be defined, then it does not belong to the set of undefinable numbers, but the definition picks it out precisely as a member of that set. And if it cannot be defined, then the definition fails to refer to anything at all, and yet the definition seems perfectly coherent, grammatically correct, and mathematically precise. Richard's paradox exposes a fundamental problem with the concept of definability, the idea that we can cleanly separate describable objects from indescribable ones, because the act of describing the indescribable creates a loop that collapses into contradiction. Some logicians argue that the phrase cannot be defined in a finite number of words is itself vague or improperly formalized, that it mixes informal natural language with formal mathematical concepts in a way that generates confusion, and that a more rigorous treatment would prevent the paradox from arising. Others suggest that the paradox reveals a hierarchy in language, that definitions must be made within specific formal systems, and that talking about all possible definitions requires stepping outside the system into a meta-language, and that mixing these levels is where the contradiction appears. Alfred Tarski developed this idea into a full theory of truth and definability, showing that no language can fully express its own semantic concepts without risking paradox, that truth and definability must always be relativized to a particular formal system, and that higher order languages are needed to talk about lower order ones. Richard's paradox also influenced the development of computability theory, because the question of whether a number can be defined in a finite number of words is closely related to whether it can be computed by a finite algorithm, and paradoxes like Richard's helped clarify the distinction between computable and non-computable reals. The paradox remains a haunting reminder that language, even mathematical language, has limits, that not everything that exists can be captured in words, and that the boundary between the describable and the indescribable is not as stable as it first appears. Synesthesia. Paradox: why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme color synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colors, and you read this text and every letter has its own color. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colors are vivid, are as clear as real colors, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The color is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this coloring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly colored experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colors conflict with synesthetic colors, can create confusion. And yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they're often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as colored, that the colors are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates color area, the region that processes color, and this cross-activation produces the experience of colored letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, color areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned or eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound-colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. The analysis paradox. Philosophy has long been concerned with analysis, with taking complex concepts and breaking them down into simpler components, with providing definitions that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term, and this project of conceptual analysis seems both important and straightforward. We want to know what knowledge is, what justice is, what truth is, and we proceed by analysing these concepts, by stating explicitly what they mean, by giving definitions that capture their essential features. Yet there is a paradox lurking here, a puzzle about whether analysis is even possible. And this is the paradox of analysis, first articulated clearly by C.H. Langford, and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore and others in the early 20th century. The paradox can be stated simply: suppose we offer an analysis of some concept. For example, we might analyse the concept brother as male sibling, and this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what brotherhood consists in, should illuminate the concept by making its structure explicit. But if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning. They must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect. It would not capture what brotherhood really is. And if they are synonymous, then the statement brother means male sibling should be trivial, should be like saying brother means brother, a mere tautology that provides no new information. And so, the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. And if it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. The paradox threatens the entire project of conceptual analysis, because it suggests that analysis cannot do what it is supposed to do, cannot both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that meaning, cannot be both true and interesting. And so either conceptual analysis is impossible, or our understanding of what analysis is and what it aims to achieve must be revised. One response to the paradox distinguishes between sense and reference, between the meaning of a term and what it picks out, and argues that an analysis can be informative even if the analysandum and analysans refer to the same thing, because they can differ in sense, in the way they present or describe that thing. And so the analysis brother means male sibling is informative, because even though brother and male sibling refer to the same set of individuals, they present that set in different ways, one as a family relation and the other as a combination of gender and kinship. And this difference in sense makes the identity statement informative rather than trivial. Another response appeals to a distinction between conceptual and factual knowledge, arguing that analysis does not provide factual knowledge about the world, but conceptual knowledge about our own concepts, that it makes explicit what was already implicit in our understanding, that it brings to consciousness the structure of concepts that we already possess and use, but have not fully articulated. And so, the informativeness of analysis is not the informativeness of discovering new facts, but the informativeness of self-clarification, of making our own conceptual commitments explicit and transparent. A third response associated with Quine and others skeptical of the analytic-synthetic distinction denies that there is a sharp line between conceptual analysis and empirical investigation, arguing that all beliefs form a holistic web where conceptual revisions and factual discoveries are intertwined, and that what we call analysis is really just careful reflection on our current best theory of the world, subject to revision in light of new evidence or theoretical considerations. And on this view, the paradox dissolves, because analysis is not supposed to be a priori or purely conceptual, but is continuous with empirical inquiry, and so it can be both correct and informative without any mystery. The paradox also raises questions about the methodology of philosophy, about whether philosophy can make progress through analysis or whether some other method is needed. And different philosophical traditions have taken different stances, with analytic philosophy traditionally emphasizing conceptual analysis as a central tool, while continental philosophy has been more skeptical of analysis, focusing instead on interpretation, critique, and phenomenological description. And the paradox of analysis has been one factor driving some philosophers away from traditional analysis toward other approaches. The paradox connects to issues about understanding and competence because we seem to have a kind of implicit or tacit understanding of concepts like knowledge, justice, and truth. We can use these concepts correctly, can apply them to particular cases, can recognize when they are used inappropriately, and yet when asked to state explicitly what these concepts mean, to provide a definition, we struggle. And this suggests that conceptual competence does not require explicit knowledge of definitions, that understanding can be practical and procedural rather than theoretical and propositional, and that analysis attempts to convert implicit understanding into explicit knowledge, a conversion that is difficult and perhaps impossible to complete without remainder. The paradox also appears in the context of philosophical disagreement, because philosophers have been offering analyses of key concepts for millennia, and yet consensus remains elusive. Different philosophers provide different analyses of knowledge, of justice, of truth, and it is not always clear how to adjudicate between competing analyses, whether by appeal to intuitions about particular cases, by considerations of theoretical simplicity and fruitfulness, or by some other standard, and the lack of agreement raises the question of whether these concepts have determinate meanings that analysis can discover, or whether they are vague, contested, or essentially contested, such that no single analysis could capture all the ways they are legitimately used. The analysis paradox remains a puzzle at the heart of philosophy, a question about what philosophy is doing when it offers definitions and analyses, whether it is discovering pre-existing meanings, stipulating new ones, or engaging in some more complex activity that combines elements of discovery, stipulation, and rational reconstruction, and the paradox has not been definitively resolved. Different philosophers find different responses more or less compelling, and the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the nature and methods of philosophical inquiry. And the concept sits there, waiting to be analysed, inviting us to state its essence, to specify its conditions, to make explicit what we already implicitly know, and yet the analysis, when offered, seems either to tell us nothing new or to change the subject, to offer a different concept rather than clarifying the original one. And the paradox persists, a thorn in the side of analysis, a reminder that understanding is more elusive than it appears, that the gap between knowing how to use a concept and knowing what it means is wider than we thought, and that philosophy, despite its ancient commitment to clarity and definition, to making the implicit explicit and the confused clear, may be chasing a goal that is inherently problematic, inherently paradoxical, a goal that recedes as we approach it, that becomes more obscure the more we try to illuminate it, and yet we continue to analyse, to offer definitions, to seek clarity, because the alternative, giving up on understanding, seems worse. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied. that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience, and the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, I don't know, I can't see anything there. And the experimenter says, just guess. Point to where you think it is, and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components: conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience. And this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential. And this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blind sight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes, and blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blind sight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research, a real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways. And the blind sight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false. And now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims. But if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves, and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back, and if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. And the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child. The mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promiser's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap.